Hello, Sophie here. So I have a whole video about fill materials, and in that I briefly mentioned stamps, but today we're really going to dive in. Also, in honor of this video, I just released a pack of all of my personal handmade ink and watercolor stamps, over 500 in total. And so yeah, as always, I really appreciate you. If you're able and willing to support me financially, that goes a long way. Thank you. So, for my first ever foray into grease pencil stamps, I made them into these brushes. I made 90, and the thing I was most proud of was that each brush had a unique cover image, and so I really enjoyed scrolling through them. And so the material for these stamps were stroke materials with the line type squares, meaning that if we look at our scene in solid view mode, they show up as black squares. And the style is texture. And so that gave us this option for inserting an image. The blend value of all of these stamps is 1, meaning that vertex colors could be used with them. And then in terms of geometry, these show up in our blend files in edit mode as a single point. And so my main frustration with these stamps with a stroke material is that they could not be rotated. I tried so hard to find a way to rotate them, and I could not. They can be moved with G, but that's about it. And I remember being able to scale them, but I'm no longer able to scale them, so maybe I dreamed that. So I'm not able to rotate or scale the stamp texture. In the brushes settings in stroke and randomize, I completely randomized the UV value, meaning I would just kind of do multiple stamps and hope to get the right rotation. The only method I was able to find to rotate them in sculpt mode was with the randomize tool, and you have it affect the UV. But then it was random and frustrating. And then there was also the option in the materials to affect the rotation of the stamp this way. But then of course, if you have multiple stamps with the same material, it will rotate all of them. On the other hand, something that this attempt had that my new stamps don't have is that these stroke stamps rotate with the view. And so you see the stamp texture from every angle. Whereas in my new method, the stamps look obviously 2D and flat when rotated. And so I now use fill materials to make my stamps. So the box for stroke is completely unchecked, and then I set the fill style to texture. I don't touch the base color, and then by opening the image, I can select one of my many transparent PNG stamps and add it to my file. At the bottom, I've also set the location values to -1 for both the X and the Y, and I check on the box for clip image, and I'll explain what these settings do a bit later in the video. And then I have 2 stamp material options. The first is for my color stamps, meaning that they have a blend value of 0, so that the colors of the image will show up unaffected by vertex colors. So that image had a pretty uniform color. But what I really like about these is that I'm able to have stamps that may have a gradient or may have more than a single color to them. And then in edit mode, I can select the stroke, and then I can move it with G and rotate it with R. But I can't scale it with S, unfortunately. And so for that, I use the transform fill tool, and this allows me as well to move it, to rotate it, and wonderfully to scale it. And then I can always further modify the stamp. In the materials properties tab, if I go into base color, I have this alpha value slider with which I can make it less opaque. And I can also modify the blend value to have the vertex color affected more or less. And I must say that often with my color stamps, I do like to have vertex color affect them somewhat. So I can go into vertex paint mode and brush a bit of color into the stamps. And then with the blend mode, affect just how intensely the vertex colors affect the colors. I love it. And then if you ever have multiple of the same stamps and you would like to modify certain material values for only one of them, you can make a new material slot, select your material, press this 2 icon to duplicate it, and with one of your strokes selected, you can assign it to that material, and then you can modify them independently. And so this isn't something that I want to do too often because it is an extra step, and so that's why I definitely appreciate the transform fill tool, because I can have 2 stamps from the same material, and I don't need to use the material's properties to rotate, scale, or move them. I can do that all with the transform fill. So then my next stamp option, stamp 2, is for my black and white transparent PNG stamps. And so the only difference is that now the blend value is all the way at 1, so that the vertex color completely affects the stamp. And so I use a ton of stamps in each artwork that I make, and so inevitably I'm going to need to add more stamp materials. And so you can actually select each stamp material and then press on this icon to save it as a preset. And so you can see I already have them here, but all you need to do is rename the preset to whatever you want and press the plus icon. And then to create a new stamp material, you would just need to press the plus icon, create a new material, and then press the icon again to select one of the presets. And then you would just need to add the image. And then you can even go into the presets menu and right click to add them to your quick favorites. And you can even right click over the plus icon to add that to your quick favorites. So then while you're hovering over the materials properties tab, you can just press Q, press add material slot, and then new, and then choose one of your presets from the quick favorites. And so this method does mean that the materials are just named material, but I am trying to get into the habit of taking just like a few extra seconds to name my materials, just to give future Sophie an idea of like what the actual image is. And I also mentioned this because one con of using this fill material method as compared to using stroke materials is that it can be really hard to select the correct stamp stroke in edit mode, especially when you have a lot of stamps layered on top of one another. And so it wasn't always super easy with the stroke material stamps, but usually you could select the point by selecting roughly in the middle of the stamp that you wanted. But selecting fill material stamps, because the stroke can be like so much larger than the actual stamp image, a lot of times can be a shot in the dark. But if you name your materials, then you can go into edit mode, find the material that you want, and then use the select button to select it. And so I like to use this in addition to using different layers and keeping on the setting called auto lock inactive layers. And then, because I have literally hundreds of stamps, how I usually approach this is that I'll look through my folder. I'll have it up next to my artwork, and so I'll decide in advance, and then when I add a new material and I open to find the image, I can just use the search function to type in the number and then find it that way and add it. And so before we leave Blender, here are a couple tips to make the process of using stamps easier. And so for these stamps, I mostly just use the pencil brush, and then I can go into the brush settings. And in post-processing, I bring the simplify value up to about 0.05, which just keeps the point count quite small, you know, saving on geometry, saving on space. But this still allows me to get these really beautiful textures. And the second tip is for masking the stamp. So I really like using stamps that are contained to a very specific shape or area. And so with the stroke material option, I would need to use a mask layer to mask certain stamps, and this could make the layer count get quite large. And indeed, with the fill materials, I can use the same method, but with the fill materials, we also have the option to use the stroke shape of the fill itself. So the first option for this is that I could draw the stamp stroke as the shape itself that I want to fill, and then select it in edit mode, and use the transform fill tool to fill it as desired. But as you're seeing, and as I talked about in my materials video, the transform fill tool, specifically the translate option, is very much affected by how you draw your stroke and And so I instead like to use that to my advantage. I like to draw my stamp strokes clockwise from left to right so that I know that I can translate the stamp and move it as I wish without as much of a headache. And then I can go into sculpt mode and use the push or the grab tools to reshape the stamp to have it not go past the shape that I want. And so because of how fill materials work, if I were to move either of the first two strokes, it will move the stamp itself, but only those first two strokes. And so what I can do is go into edit mode. I typically use stroke select mode to select the stroke as a whole, but then I can go into point select mode and just deselect the first 2 points. And now if I go to sculpt mode, I am free to move everything about exactly as I wish, and the stamp will stay in place. And then, since I mentioned I use a pretty reduced vertex count, sometimes for doing this, that's not enough vertices to actually wrap around the area that I want properly. And so what I like to do in this case in edit mode is just to shift select some points in the areas that I want to add more geometry to, and then I can right click and subdivide a few times so that it becomes easier to get smooth shapes in this way. And so I am adding more geometry, but I'm at least only adding it where I need it. So tip number 3, so it recently happened, to my great sadness, that I reopened some old blend files to find that the stamps were all broken. Basically, the link had been severed over the months of using stamps. Like, I end up modifying them, maybe moving them around in my files or renaming them. And so to avoid this from happening, what I can do this after a piece is complete. So I can go into File, External Data, and I can pack the resources. But I am currently experimenting with automatically packing the resources. So I have this setting checked in my default starter 2D animation file. So far, so good, I'm liking it. From what I've read, it seems like this just makes your blend file bigger. So I'll see whether or not I'll keep this, but I would definitely like to keep my old blend files and be able to open them and to not have this happen. And then my last little tip, I did change some colors for the Blender file view so that I could see the stamps better. And so to do that, I just went into Edit, Preferences, and then that is in Themes, File Browser, Theme Space, and then I made the window background a light gray, and I also made the text and title colors black. And this just has made it a lot easier to navigate and to look through them. All right, so now we're gonna move to Krita because we are all about that free and open source software here. And I will share how I make the stamps themselves. If you want to check out last week's video, the whole second half did show some time lapses of me making these stamps, along with kind of just casually chatting about how I've been using them. And so I will open a file. I have some that I haven't converted into PNGs yet. So they are just JPEGs that I downloaded from the Project Gutenberg website. So all public domain works. And so the first thing is that you want it to be square. Otherwise, it will be drawn into the blend file stretched. And so the easiest way I found to do this in Krita is to press Ctrl-R to use the box select tool, and then hold Shift as you drag to select a square, and then let go, press C, and Enter to crop the canvas to that shape. And we can see down here, I managed to make it 500 by 500, which proves that I am a wizard. Not a pixel more or less. And so you may have noticed I went bigger than the stamp file itself. And this is something I tend to do because another important thing to keep in mind is that you want all of the edges of your stamp to be transparent. Within the stamps, I checked on the box for clipping so that it would display only one single stamp. Otherwise, it creates a repeating pattern of the stamps, which may be good for some purposes, is not exactly how I personally want to use stamps. And so if any part of the image touches any of the edges, it will definitely affect the clipping weirdly. And also, with this in mind of displaying only one stamp at a time, this is why I have the locations values both set to -1, because from experience, this is just the best setting to have the stamp always show up within the stroke. And so now what I want to do with my image is I go into Filter, Colors, and Color to Alpha, and press Enter. And so now everything but the actual image, the actual lines of the image, is transparent. Amazing. And so the way that this filter actually works is that it will make like pure black colors fully opaque, and then as the color gets lighter, it becomes more transparent. And I really like what it does to the images. I have a lot of success using it, and I mean, it's so simple. It's just one button click, which I love. And so I used this so much that I made it a shortcut. So I go into Settings, Configure Krita, Keyboard Shortcuts, and then you can search Color to Alpha. And then in Custom, I have made it Control Numpad period. Other ways that I adjust the stamps, I could go into Filter, Adjust Levels, but that also is the shortcut Control L. And so by modifying the output level, sometimes I like to do this to make the whole stamp lighter. Or I can modify the input levels to make the whole thing more or less contrasting. And so another one I've been experimenting with is the threshold value. Filter, Adjust Threshold. And so this creates a black and white image, no grays, no in-betweens, and you can modify it with the slider. I'm all about having multiple options, and in some cases I do think it's really cool. And then when I'm ready, I just export it as a PNG and just press OK. And then for color stamps, I do much the same things. I might modify the levels differently. I actually do like using the bottom slider a lot for my color stamps to make the whole thing lighter. And then I use Control U to bring up the hue saturation value sliders. I do like to take a lot of liberty with the colors. And so this is meant to be added as a texture more than necessarily an image. And so for many of my stamps, I like that they're quite abstract. And so over time, I've just gotten a sense of what kind of colors I like. And then for some stamps, I want to use only specific parts of them. And so for this, I just use Control R to box select around the area I want. And then I use the eraser tool, this first one, to roughly isolate them. Not going for perfect here. And then I'll also use the eraser tool just to make sure that, like I mentioned, nothing touches any of the edges. And then I do also sometimes as well adjust the color adjustment. I use this especially when there's like a very dark line art that I'm not able to give a color to. And so I can pick either red, green, or blue, and then just raise this first icon to color the dark parts of the piece or the line art one of these colors. So that is everything I have to say about stamps. It only spanned 3 videos. So I hope that this was helpful. Like I mentioned, this is something that I use in every single piece that I make. I'm hooked. I can't get over it. And so I would really love to see what this inspires. If this inspires you to make anything, if you make anything with my stamps, I would be so honored if you tagged me. You can find me all over the internet at Sophie Jantak. I hope you're doing well. I hope you're having a good new year. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. And I will see you very soon. Goodbye.